I'm Japanese and my story is about English. So when I say the words, I was talking to my friend and I said, I'm gonna just practice my presentation. But my friend said, what are you going to do? I said, practice. No, I was pronouncing L, but of course I had to pronounce with L, and he pointed out. And then when I was writing an email to my supervisor, for people who work in syntax, we have to put some words to explain what the sentence is meaning. And then I was using the word gross, to mean gloss, which is GL. Or SS, but I just made a mistake, and then in his reply to my email, he said, by the way, it is not gross, but gloss. So I just made a stupid mistake to my supervisor.
So you put the spelling G-R-O-S-S? Yeah,
that's what I did.
Okay.
And then lastly was, I went to clothes shopping last weekend, and I bought some clothes, but I didn't bring that with me. And then I went back to the shop next day, and then I said to the lady at the shop, oh, I bought a piece of clothes yesterday, and I just came and to correct my clothes. And then she got confused. She didn't understand what I'm saying. And I just thought, okay, I'm sure I'm speaking English, right? And then I just came to correct, but, and then she just finally realized, okay, you came to collect, which is C-O-L-L-E. So yeah, that's a mistake I always do.
Okay, well my story is about when I was an au pair in Vienna in Austria, and I was speaking German with the family that I was living with, and I'd done A-level German before I went there and felt like, you know, my German was pretty reasonable. And I noticed that for the evening meal sometimes we would have pasta with this homemade sauce that was called Paradeisersauce. And I thought, wow, Paradeisersauce, you know, how lovely that sounds, paradise sauce. And I didn't know what it contained, but anyway, it was really nice, and I felt like I was really succeeding in my German if the family would say, oh, Heather, could you get the Paradeisersauce out of the fridge? And I would go and get it and, you know, be able to locate it even though I didn't really know what it was. But eventually, after some time in Vienna, I discovered that Paradeiser is actually just a Viennese dialect word for tomato. So my wonderful Paradeisersauce was actually Tomatensauce, and it was still nice, but it never tasted quite as exotically delicious again.
So I studied French at university, and during my year abroad I wanted to try to get in as many very French phrases as possible. And one night I was at a party with some friends, and it got a bit late, and a friend asked what the time was. So it was exactly midnight. I thought, oh, opportunity to use a good French phrase, because if you say minuit poil, it means exactly midnight. Unfortunately, what I said was minuit à poil, and when his eyebrows shot up into his hairline, I realised that I'd actually said naked midnight.
So my language learning story is about learning French in a comprehensive school in Sheffield, in classes where nobody had done any French before, and particularly trying to get over the accent barrier, where students, myself included, would just find it almost, you know, impossible to shake off, if you like, their home Yorkshire dialect with French pronunciations, you know, and for right the way through you would get these, what I suppose if you know French now, any sort of quite amusing pronunciations of things like bonjour for bonjour, and, you know, even things like je m'appelle for how you might say hello, my name is. And it was just funny because, you know, whatever teachers tried to do, they just couldn't seem to get through that. You know, you had to say these things in a different way. And it wasn't until I came to university and started studying phonetics that you start to think back and you start realising, you're like, oh, actually, yeah, that's what that is, you know, when you abstract away from it. But yeah, it must be very hard for teachers when they're trying to teach kids how to do it, and not only teach them a different language, but actually teach them to get rid of their own dialect as well.
Sure. So my story is about Cantonese. So I lived in Hong Kong for a year, And before I was going, everyone said, oh, you're going to struggle with the tones if you try and learn Cantonese. So because I had a lot of Hong Kong friends, I made the effort, and more or less I was always understood. If I got a word, that's what they understood, apart from where I lived. So I lived in a building called Harbour View Horizon, which was 10 minutes away from Harbour Front Horizon. So Harbour View Horizon was Hoi Wan Hin, and Harbour Front Horizon was Hoi Wan Hin. Now, even when I was sober, this is difficult enough, but after a few wines post-work, this became really difficult. And whenever I get in a taxi and I would ask to go to Hoi Wan Hin, I'd get taken to the other one, 10 minutes away. This was quite funny to begin with, and me and friends would get taxis and almost bet whether or not the taxi driver would take us to the right place or to Harbour Front Horizon. But after a while, it started to get quite inconvenient. So the building next to where I lived was a local polytechnic college called Lei Gong Dai Ho Suk Sei. So I learned to say that, and I always got to that place instead. So for pretty much the whole time in Hong Kong, I would ask to get taken to the local polytech rather than where I live, because I just could never get Harbour View Horizon right.
During my year abroad in France, we decided to go on a walk in quite a famous place. It's called La Planche des Belles Filles. So if you like the Tour de France, you might have heard of it as a big climb. It's this hill that's full of old mines and lots of history. And a group of us went to walk around the mines, and we couldn't find the start of the trail anywhere. And then a van pulled up at the bottom of the hill. It was a van belonging to a sculptor who lived locally, and we thought we'd ask him to show us where the start of the trail was. He said, absolutely. In fact, I'll take you round, I'll tell you the history of the mines, show you some of my sculptures. And this is what I ask in return. I would love to make a sculpture about the song Stairway to Heaven, because it's one of my favourite songs, but I have no idea what the lyrics are about. So would one of you translate Stairway to Heaven into French for me? Of course we said yes. He took us around the mountains and we learned a lot of the local history and saw some fantastic sculptures. And then afterwards, when we got back to the towns we lived in, we translated Stairway to Heaven into French for him. I don't know how much use it was, because if anyone knows the song, it's completely mad. So I don't think it made any sense, but hopefully it did turn into a sculpture at some point.
So I was on my year abroad in Cairo, nearly 30 years ago, and I decided that I would drink tap water. It's perfectly safe in Cairo. And I needed to know the word to ask for tap water. I didn't know. I hadn't done much Arabic by the time I went out there. And somebody told me that it was Maya min al-Hanafiya. But I only heard this once from this friend. Thought I'd got it, what it was, go into a restaurant, order my plate of beans, bread, and could I have some Maya Mekhalifiyya, please, which is slightly different. Maya Mekhalifiyya instead of Maya min al-Hanafiyya. And the waiter stared at me and said, harder, which is the Egyptian Arabic for okay, and brought me some bottled water, because what I'd actually asked for was some fertile water instead of tap water.
I used to work in Finland teaching English, and one of the places where I taught was in the headquarters of the Finnish Social Security Institution, and one of the people I would teach there, we had one-to-one sessions, was this man who I will call Niemi, and he was a small, jolly man, very nice man, and he used to enjoy coming to lunch with me. And one time over lunch, it was getting close to May Day, which is a very big event in Finland. Everybody goes crazy on the night before May Day. They have these wild parties and dress up in silly clothes and stuff. And one of the things they make is a drink. It's a kind of weak homebrew, which they call mead. And he was telling me how to do it. So you take plastic bottle and put lemon and sugar in it, and then raisins. Russians. Yes, raisins. Few raisins put in the bottle and leave lid, and it ferments. It turns out the Finnish word for raisin is rusina.
Okay, well, I guess the most interesting language experience I've had probably is I was in Estonia, which is where my husband was born, and I was visiting my mother-in-law and my sister-in-law, And I had with me, on that occasion, a cousin of my mother's. So my mother-in-law and my mother's cousin were both in their 80s at the time. And they were very interested in each other because my mother-in-law had never really traveled outside Estonia, but was a language teacher, a writer of German grammars, a very sort of an intellectual person. And my mother's cousin had traveled all over the world as a businesswoman and was very, very outgoing and friendly, had talked to a lot of people. So she'd had a lot of world experiences, and my mother-in-law had had a different kind of experiences, and they just were fascinated by each other. But they didn't have a language in common. So my mother's cousin was a French speaker, and my mother-in-law was Estonian. She knew a little bit of school-age French, I think. So I was translating between the two of them, and what I quickly discovered is that I couldn't tell whether I was paraphrasing what someone just said in the same language or translating. Sometimes I translated, sometimes I paraphrased. And so it was funny in two ways. First of all, when you paraphrase, the other person knows that you're using the same language. You're saying what they just said, but you've changed it. Maybe you've simplified it, and that's a little bit funny. And the other thing is the other person doesn't understand it. So my mother's cousin took to going, every time I was paraphrasing instead of translating, and it went on like that. And so I thought it was amazing because I could only tell which I was doing, even once I was aware of it, if I stopped and listened to myself. I couldn't tell while I was talking which language I was using. It was a very funny experience. It only happens when you know two languages fluently, and it's much more likely, I think, to happen between a second and a third language, which was the case here. Later, I read other accounts of the same experience by other linguists, and more recently, I noticed that it was happening to me just a week ago in France. I was speaking French to some people and Estonian to my family, which was visiting in France. And again, I was having trouble translating, using the right language with the right person. So that's the experience.